Thanks everyone for coming. I just want to introduce Mel and then I'm going to hand over and let her take us away. So this is one of our Centre for International and Public Law seminars. We're very lucky to have with us Dr. Melanie O'Brien, who is Associate Professor at the University of Western Australia. In addition to that, she's also President of the International Association of Genocide Scholars. She is a member of the WA International Humanitarian Law Committee of the Australian Red Cross. Her work has been started by the International Criminal Court. And as Mel was telling me earlier, this is a great example of how case studies can, in fact, make an impact internationally. And I think Mel's work is a really good example of that. She has been amicus curiae before the International Criminal Court as well. She has done field work across 6 continents and been an expert consultant for multiple UN bodies. And what she's going to talk to us today about is her book called From Discrimination to Death, which I'm going to read this bit, studies the process of genocide through the human rights violations that occurred during genocide, using individual testimonies and in-depth field research from the Armenian Genocide, the Holocaust, and the Cambodian Genocide. And there are some of the flyers that Charlene will put out with the discount code for the book as well. So please join me in thanking Mel.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Oh, sounds loud now. Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be able to be in Canberra and to talk to you guys about my book. I've actually been in Canberra with the Armenians, Greeks and Assyrians lobbying the federal government to recognise the Armenian Genocide. So it's very much, what I've been here for is very much connected to the content of my book, which I will be telling you about momentarily. Thank you for coming today. I appreciate it. I know it's a Friday afternoon and maybe you want to get home, but hopefully this is, hopefully this will be an interesting way to ease into your weekend, if not uplifting, but hopefully interesting. So today I want to talk to you about my book, which I have just published with Routledge, From Discrimination to Death, Genocide Process Through a Human Rights Lens. So what I will do is I'll give you a general overview of the book, and then I will talk about a little bit, I'll pull a case study from the book. Maybe 2 if we have time, but I probably won't. The first thing I wanted to do was acknowledgement of country. This is my acknowledgement from UWA, where I do my work, but of course I want to acknowledge that today we're meeting on the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So this is my book, and I've got a discount code for you guys, which is on the table back there. Although, of course, it's still only in hardback, so it's still pretty pricey. So you may want to wait till it comes out in paperback and is slightly more affordable for the academic price. So basically, to give you an overview of the book itself, essentially what I'm doing is, in genocide studies, we talk about genocide as a process, not an event. And a few people have written their own theories about how this process takes place. But the way I wanted to look at it was to take 3 case studies, the Armenian Genocide, the Holocaust, and the Cambodian Genocide, so historical case studies, and to see if there was any kind of pattern to the types of human rights violations that occur through the genocide process. And I found that there was. So this is a difficult thing to explain to survivors, but academics understand where I'm coming from because they see that it's a theoretical thing. Because when I explain this to survivors, their response is, we have no human rights. And of course, that's true. But what I'm focusing on is which human rights are targeted by the perpetrators of genocide as part of that genocide process to carry out the genocide. So it's a difficult one to explain to survivors themselves. And I had, last year I was a research fellow at the Sydney Jewish Museum interviewing survivors in continuation of the studies from my book. And so it was a bit of a challenge to explain to them. And the piece that I'm going to write from that, I think I won't focus on human rights. What I was looking at was the right to sanitation, but I think I'll take that right aspect out of it because the survivors will read it and may think it's a little bit strange. So I have to target how I frame it for different audiences. But the purpose when we do research into genocide process is essentially to understand how and why genocide takes place as a way of understanding that process, so hopefully we can prevent genocides from happening in the future. But also, which I'll go into in a minute, is hopefully contributing to prosecutions as well. So I look at 3 historical case studies, as I've mentioned: the Armenian Genocide, which was from 1915 until 1922 or 23, the Holocaust from the 1930s and 40s, and the Cambodian Genocide that took place under the Khmer Rouge in the late 1970s. And I chose those case studies mainly because, of course, I was already working on them, particularly the Holocaust, already had a lot of knowledge. But I also wanted to pick genocides that were at different points in the 20th century and that seemingly on face value may have differences to them, to see whether there was any difference between them and how they took place. What I actually discovered was that there is a distinct pattern in all of them as to how they took place. So what I thought would be differences actually weren't there, and the only differences I found were I'll give you the best example. So in all of the genocides, torture is a really strong component, but the way it is carried out differs between genocides, but remains consistent within that particular genocide. So that I found these kind of elements to be really, really interesting. And I obviously can't tell you about everything today, but I will be going through the right to housing with you today, so you can see how that plays a role. I do also include a current case study, which is the Rohingya genocide. So what I do is I look at the 3 historical case studies and I look at rights. And on the next slide, I'm going to take you through the rights that I look at. So each chapter is focused on a right or a group of related rights. And I look at how they were violated in the 3 historical case studies. And then at the end, I have a chapter on the Rohingya genocide. So the last place that I went before COVID was Bangladesh, and I was in the refugee camps interviewing women, Rohingya refugees there. And so the pictures that I've put on this slide are all photos that were taken there. So I've got a photo in the bottom corner of me with one of my interpreters who was with me, some fabulous young women who had just finished their studies. And the other 2 photos are with a couple of the women that I was privileged enough to interview. And it gives you an idea of the kind of housing that they're living in now, which is going to be relevant to what I'm going to talk about a little bit later. But you can see they're just living in these bamboo and tarpaulin shacks. And if you see the photo with my interpreter in the background, you can see how many of them there are. And there have been quite a few fires, including in the past fortnight, there was a fire that destroyed about 10,000 of these shacks. So in looking at a current case study, the idea is to say, okay, I found this pattern from historical case studies. Does it work in this current situation that we've got? And the answer is yes. So what I'm showing there is to say, actually, we could have stopped what happened in 2017 when the violence escalated and 10,000 Rohingya were killed and 1 million of them fled across the border into Bangladesh. So the idea behind my pattern and behind framing it from a human rights lens is to show that actually we could use the human rights system to prevent genocide when it's about midstream. And I'll demonstrate midstream on the next slide. And by showing a current case, I can show here's where you could have done that, so that we may have been able to prevent it. I mean, it would have been a challenge because Myanmar is a hermit state and doesn't really engage with international law, of course, but at least this is something where you can say, hang on, here is a very specific pattern of human rights abuses that we've been tracking. We're actually in the genocide process. So what I'm not saying is that genocide is a risk. I'm saying we're already in the process and it will escalate and we should take action to stop it before it escalates. So that's what I'm hoping that my book will contribute to from a prevention angle. I also hope that it will contribute to prosecution and conviction because, as we know, genocide is extremely difficult to prove, particularly because of the necessity to prove the dolus specialis, the special intent, the intent to destroy the group. And what I hope is that in reading my book and in understanding the pattern, that a prosecutor can bring that pattern to the circumstances that they're prosecuting and say, actually, it fits this pattern. So we can bring that to our argument to say, you know, this is why we brought genocide charges and genocide did happen. And then subsequently, I hope that judges can take that on board and use that when they're trying to make the decision about whether or not it actually took place. So I'm also hoping that it will be very useful when we're talking about the Rohingya case in the International Criminal Court. And I'll explain that a bit more on the next slide when I talk you through the different rights that I look at. So just to give you an idea of the research process, I spent 6 years on the book, and I did field work in all manner of countries around the world. So I interviewed survivors in Cambodia, and I interviewed Holocaust survivors in Israel in particular. I did not interview Armenian genocide survivors because they have since passed away, so there aren't any alive. And I interviewed Rohingya survivors as well. I also visited many genocide sites and museums and memorials, went in archives, digging out, so for example, in the Armenian archives, digging out survivor testimonies that were taken at the time of refugees who had made it from what is now Eastern Turkey into current day Armenia, and you know, getting hold of old documents. I met a student this week, an Armenian student, and he said to me, what do you do when you're in field work? What do you do in an archive? Like, are you getting out dusty papers? And I said, yeah, actually I am. So, you know, getting out these dusty papers from back then, which is, you know, obviously we have no person alive anymore who's a witness to that. So these are great sources. So while I'm a legal scholar, I also do a lot of empirical work that that builds on the theoretical discussions that I have in this. Essentially because I'm aiming to cross the divide between we international criminal lawyers and genocide scholars, the majority of whom are not lawyers. And one of the reasons that I wanted to write this and I structured it the way I did is because I found that in genocide studies, I came across, for example, books, chapters that were literally titled Genocide and Human Rights. And then you would read it and there would be nothing about human rights in there. And it's fair enough because we're talking about people who are authoring these who are sociologists or anthropologists, and, you know, they haven't studied human rights. So that's fine. So this is what I'm hoping will contribute in that way as well, is to bring a greater understanding of human rights and human rights law amongst genocide scholars so they can understand that conversation. Because in particular, one of the things that I argue is that the Genocide Convention is not a human rights treaty, it's a crime suppression treaty. It's not part of the international law human rights system that we have. It doesn't have a monitoring body. It's not about individual rights. It's about a state's obligation to criminalise and to punish the crime of genocide. So that's where it sits. And I feel like the discussion is often misses that point and refers to it as a human rights treaty. So I'm going to take you through the rights that I look at in my book. And you'll notice that they are separated into parts. So part 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Now, essentially what I'm arguing is that there is an approximate temporal order of human rights violations. But by saying that, I'm not saying discrimination happens, then they violate freedom of expression and opinion, then they violate freedom of education. There's plenty of overlapping, and some of these, for example, you know, the violation of freedom from discrimination occurs throughout the entire process. So I want to make clear that I'm not saying this is completely linear, but it's an approximate temporal escalation of the process and the types of rights violations that we see take place during genocide. So we start with freedom from discrimination, which is overarching and obviously continues until the end, because all of the rights violations that are carried out, with the exception of expression and opinion, are targeted are aimed solely at the target group, at the minority victim group. So it's discrimination all the way through. But I start with discrimination because often we see the process of genocide start with things like the implementation of laws which target that particular group, discriminatory laws. The best example, of course, that I'm sure you're all familiar with, known as the Nuremberg laws under the Nazi regime. But actually the Nazis, sometimes these people are a bit really crazy. The laws that they pass, we often hear about the really big ones, preventing, Jews from practicing law, for example. But they were passing laws like, Jewish people can't use carrier pigeons and really random stuff like that. So they were really obsessed with this idea of excluding Jewish people from every single aspect of society. So that's part one. Part two is essentially the first group of rights that takes place. And it's basically at the end of part two and maybe the end of part three where I argue we can see the pattern of genocide and that we should start taking action before it escalates to part three or particularly part four. So part two, freedom of expression and opinion, is a really interesting one. I'm not going to go into too much detail. I do have an entire talk on that as well because it's really fascinating because, in fact, they're not just violating the right to freedom of expression and opinion of the target group, but the entire population through propaganda, through control of the media, in terms of ensuring that the majority population is essentially brainwashed into thinking that this target group is the enemy, they're diseased, they're a threat to our nation, and they have to be destroyed. But that starts quite early on and continues throughout the entire process, where we have essentially someone, usually, very high level in the government, who's in control of the message that gets disseminated consistently through the media, but also through other means, popular like the radio and things like that. The next one is education and cultural rights, so restricting people from being able to have an education and restricting their ability to actually carry out their own culture as well. But also even little things like, again, in the laws the Nazis brought in, Jewish people couldn't go to the cinema, things like that. So not even just about their culture, but being able to participate in culture more broadly in society. Employment, fair trial, association, public service rights. So this is where we find people's ability to work generally restricted. It sort of starts with, though, public service, where they are restricted from working in the public service, except sometimes for the military, where they might be conscripted into the military. In the case of the Armenian Genocide, they were forcibly put into the military, but they are not allowed to participate in things like public service, not allowed to run for office. And then that escalates into other areas of employment as well. For example, you can only have Armenian schools. You can't work in a Turkish school, for example. Fair trial rights as well, I have a bit of a look at, where essentially, if you look at the Ottoman Empire, the history of the Armenians being a minority Christian population, they were always treated differently when it came to court, whether it was private or, public criminal cases. So this discrimination and their lack of ability to receive a fair trial in whatever jurisdiction it was in, exists for quite some time beforehand. Freedom of religion is quite a significant one in the process. So the four groups that can be targeted under the Genocide Convention are national, racial, ethnic, and religious. But I found that freedom of religion is often violated even if the group is not targeted as a religious group, because it is a very prominent, it's a prominent and obvious manifestation of culture. So it's easy to target. So the Armenians were targeted as Christians, but also as a nationality as well. The Jews were targeted as a race, but of course their Judaism, their practice of Judaism, their religious practice in being an overt representation of Judaism, was easily targetable as well. And the same thing under the Khmer Rouge. They didn't like religion at all, so they targeted Catholics, but notably only Khmer Catholics. Like French Catholics were allowed to leave the country. And they targeted their main religion, Buddhism, as well. The rights to family and privacy. Family is fairly obvious. A lot of people lose their family in genocide. But privacy is less obvious. And it covers a lot of remits. So, for example, living in the ghetto, overcrowded ghettos, I'll talk about that a bit later. I'll be talking about it in the context of the right to housing, but think about the right to privacy when you're looking at these as well. In ghettos and camps, you have no physical privacy as well. There's no all of these areas of privacy that exist, even informational privacy, all of these kinds of things are very specifically violated as well. I look at child rights. So from looking at the Convention on the Rights of the Child, I look at a few specific ones. So obviously some child rights cross over with the other ones, particularly the right to family. But I look at specific ones like the right to identity, but also something that I found really interesting is the right to rest, leisure and play, which is taken away from children. And is, something really interesting. I found some really interesting things in my research, like survivors talking about how they would play in Auschwitz, and they would play counting the dead bodies in a pile. So actually what happened was they were still playing, but the surroundings became part of that and normalized into the way they played. So some really interesting findings there. So that's part two, where that's the first point where I argue you could step in and say, hang on, we've got a very specific process going on, so we could have some prevention measures in place. Part three is where we start to escalate. So we're looking at freedom of movement, the right to liberty and security of person, and freedom from slavery. So this is where we start to see things like slavery and forced labour come into play. We start to see the targeted populations put into places like camps or ghettos and those kinds of places, so they can't move around. So taking away their freedom of movement, their ability to go outside these areas, but also their ability to leave the country as well. So often what we see is that the majority of refugees have fled before this point, but once we get to this point, it's very difficult to leave. This all very naturally progresses into violations of the right to health and the right to adequate standard of living. And this is where we really start to see deaths happen. So this is quite a big chapter in the book because I see it as quite fundamental to the genocide process. So right to life comes at the end, and when we think about genocide, we think about killing, express killing, but the deaths that take place, the genocidal crime of imposing conditions designed to bring about the end of life, this is where we see them happening. Starvation, forced labour, this kind of thing, these come into play, and this is where you start to see a lot of people getting very ill, dying from illness as well as starvation and overwork. So that is definitely the point as well, where we say, okay, we really are in the middle of the process now. Before we move to part four, where I look at freedom from torture and also the right to life. So I mentioned torture is ubiquitous throughout all of these, and quite also, honestly, really quite brutal in the way it's carried out. I mean, I know that might sound funny because, of course, torture is never not brutal, but it's particularly brutal, I found, and the different ways it was carried out. The right to life, I'm sure, is fairly obvious. We're talking about the explicit killings of people, for example, through mass shootings, and obviously in the extermination camps, for example, during the Holocaust. So my last part 5, looks at refugee rights, and this is something very unique in my analysis of the genocide process. And I'm not looking at the rights under the Refugee Convention. What I'm looking at is just the general experience of refugees with human rights. And I do look at a lot of the same rights and see how refugees experience that. And because of what I found, my argument is that this is also part of the genocide process. So, and not that the host country is responsible for genocide, but that the perpetrators of the genocide are responsible for that continuation of the genocide, because essentially it's foreseeable in genocide that hundreds of thousands, even millions of people are going to cross a border. They're going to end up in one place, refugee camps usually, where despite the international community's best efforts, you cannot possibly suddenly provide shelter, food, water, sanitation for 1 million people. And they already arrive sick, they already arrive possibly injured, they've walked a very long way, they may have infected wounds, they're starving. So many people die, and then they get there and they're all together in this place. Sanitation is terrible. You often have diseases like cholera that become rampant, and people die from that as well. So my argument is that that is a continuation of the process. What we also see is often very terrible security situations, safety and security, particularly for girls and women, high levels of sexual assault amongst refugees against girls and women. So again, part of it, and all foreseeable because we know this is what happens. The perpetrators will know this is what happens. In fact, it's their goal. They want them out of the territory. So they want them to cross the border. So that my argument is that, and so I'm hoping that this will be useful for the prosecutor, the ICC prosecutor, because they are using the jurisdiction of Bangladesh to bring, hopefully, to bring charges against perpetrators in Myanmar for the crimes against the Rohingya. So I'm hoping they'll be able to use this argument to bring genocide charges for that. So that's an overview. And what I wanted to talk about now is one of the particular elements of the adequate standard of living, which is housing. So adequate standard of living covers a few different things, which I go into depth in that chapter, which I found were all really relevant, which are housing, clothing, and food. I've recorded a talk about the right to clothing, if you're interested in that, for an economic, social, and cultural rights workshop we did last year, which will be hopefully online soon, because I think it's something that flies under the radar. It's known as the forgotten right, but I wanted to talk about something different today. And hopefully, if you're interested, you can have a look at that one, or read the chapter in the book as well. So essentially, when we're talking about adequate standard of living, that's what we're talking about, is those three components: housing, clothing, and food. And they're obviously all connected inherently. And I put that in the same chapter as the right to health, because they're also heavily connected as well. And what I look at is in that also is the right to sanitation, which doesn't exist as a separate right, but it's been found to fall under both the right to health and the right to adequate standard of living, and I found is quite significant in terms of its contribution to genocide. So this is an economic, social, and cultural right. So it's been looked at by the ECOSOC committee, which has emphasised the right to housing's connection with human dignity, and the fact that this is the right to adequate housing. It's not the right to housing, it's the right to adequate housing, which is quite important. And I quote the ECOSOC committee, the right to housing should not be interpreted in a narrow or restrictive sense, which equates it with, for example, the shelter provided by merely having a roof over one's head, or views shelter exclusively as a commodity. Rather, it should be seen as the right to live somewhere in security, peace, and dignity. And I think that's quite pertinent when you're thinking about what happens during genocide. So adequate housing is about privacy, space, security, lighting, ventilation, and more. So it's not just the roof over the head. The ECOSOC committee has also expressly addressed forced evictions, recognising that many instances of forced evictions are associated with violence, such as evictions resulting from international armed conflict, internal strife, and communal or ethnic violence. Obviously, they don't use the G word, but we can see that fits in there. They found that the practice of forced evictions may also result in violations of civil and political rights, such as the right to life, the right to security of the person, the right to non-interference with privacy, family and home, and the right to the peaceful enjoyment of possessions. So again, another example of the interdependence of human rights and how they're connected, and therefore how it connects in this particular process. So historically, property ownership has been connected with social citizenship, civic virtue, and potential for political participation of individuals, where those without property are marginalised and excluded with lower social status, which obviously fits the goal of the genocidaire and what they want to do to the target group. So the images that I've put on this slide are from the Armenian Genocide. It's a little bit more difficult to get images because obviously 1915 photography was a newer art form, but the photos that exist are really intriguing. So what happened was girls and women were put on death marches and they were sent into what is now the Syrian desert, where they were, I hesitate to use the word living, where they were put into concentration camps. And the camps, so you can see here images of marching through, but then you can see the other three pictures are of what it was like in the desert, in the camps. And if they were lucky, they had tents, if they were lucky, but sometimes they didn't have anything. And you can imagine it's the desert, it's really extreme temperatures. So this is what thinking about needing housing and shelter when you have extreme temperatures, that obviously you're out in the sun all day, and obviously in addition to the fact that they didn't have food and water, leads to obviously deaths from exposure. There was no evidence of sanitation facilities provided in any of these camps. One witness said that the stench of excrement was unbearable when they went to one of these camps. A German diplomat called Wilhelm Litten, he was at Meskene camp in February 1916, and he said it had no latrines, but there was a broad belt of human excrement and refuse around the town and the campsite. And essentially it was impossible to keep clean. They had no facilities, they had no water, they had no way of washing themselves. So they were living in really dirty conditions as well. And the camps held thousands of people. So Bab camp, for example, held over 100,000 people. So we're not talking about small camps. So this is the Holocaust. So I'm sure that many, if not all of you, know a lot more about the Holocaust, and will have heard of the ghettos and the camps that people lived in. These images are which I've taken from the US Holocaust Memorial Museum site, are from different ghettos that they had in different places: Łódź in Poland, Riga in Latvia, and Munkash in Czech Republic, or Czechoslovakia as it was then. So when in the ghettos, basically Jews were crowded into dilapidated apartments that were left. They had multiple families living in one apartment. So they had obviously no room for comfort, no room for privacy. As an example, in the Łódź ghetto in Poland in September 1941, they had 144,000 people living in only 25,000 rooms. The sanitation infrastructure was impossible to cope. It just couldn't cope with the excessive number of people that were in such a small space. So if you think back to the time it was, actually there weren't flushing toilets in every apartment in the 1930s and 1940s. While they existed, they didn't exist everywhere yet. So garbage and human waste accumulated in communal receptacles that were inside and also out in courtyards, and just went uncollected and overflowed. So the conditions were really horrible. So in the Łódź ghetto, there were over 31,000 apartments, but only 294 of those had inside toilets, and only 613 had running water. So imagine all those people crowded into these places with essentially no running water and no sanitation. It's also freezing cold in winter in places like Poland and Eastern Europe. And and there was minimal, if any, coal provided to ghetto inhabitants. They didn't get any wood, so the inhabitants would try and source wood through dismantling fences and old buildings, as well as floorboards, furniture, cupboards, doors, tables, this kinds of thing, in the apartments where they were living to trying to get fires, to try and keep warm. But people still froze to death in the ghettos because it was so cold. Ghettos could also have no electricity, no water. In the Łódź ghetto, in January 1941 alone, over 1,200 people died, mostly from starvation, but also freezing to death. But interestingly, conversely, heat was also an issue because it gets quite hot in summer. And a story from a survivor, Eva Lubitsky, in June 1944 in the Łódź ghetto, when it was liquidated, she and her family went into hiding in the attic in the building where they had been, trying to avoid being deported to the camps. The attic had no furniture, so they used their clothing as bedding and cushions. But what she recalls was the unbearable heat in the attic, with the space becoming a kind of an oven, and they had insufficient water. So what they would do is they would sneak out at night, they would empty their human waste bucket that they had with them, and then they would fill another bucket with water. All of this trying to be done without getting caught. It was highly risky behaviour. But after several weeks, because they were so hungry and so thirsty, and it was so hot in the attic, a heat wave arrived, and they just couldn't stay in there, and they had no choice but to leave what Eva called the furnace. And so they were driven out by the heat, and then they were captured and sent to Auschwitz. I think we also forget about people who went into hiding in different ways. And so many different places. Actually, not that long ago, at the end of last year, I was in a workshop with some Ukrainian Holocaust survivors, Holocaust researchers, and one of them was talking about how they found out that 2 Jewish brothers hid in a tree during the Holocaust, a tree. And you can look, they had a photo down inside the tree, and there had been steps put inside the tree, and they lived inside this tree. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. They found all types of places where people hid, like caves and in basements. But of course, many people, this is an example of obviously someone that I'm sure you will have all heard of, Anne Frank, who lived in part of the house in Amsterdam in the Netherlands with not only her family, but others crowded into this same space. This is a screenshot from the 3D tour that you can do on the Anne Frank House website. It's really interesting. If you want to have a look at it, you can walk your way around and click on different things, so it feels like you're in there and get a feeling of that. But many people survive this way by hiding in very small, confined spaces, having difficulty getting food, and obviously constantly worried and stressed about hiding. And something interesting is that when I was at the Sydney Jewish Museum last year, I went to one of the survivor talks, and it turned out, have any of you heard of the graphic novel called Mouse? Yeah, great. So quite a few of you. So for those of you who haven't, Mouse is a graphic novel written about the Holocaust by a Holocaust survivor. And all the characters are mice, which is why it's called Mouse, which is the German word for mouse. And this survivor, and if you're ever in Sydney, I really recommend, he's the cousin of the author, and he's in Mouse. And he showed us which of the panels, he's like, oh, that's me, I'm the little mouse. It turns out he's also Justice Spiegelman's brother. So Justice Spiegelman was born in Australia after they fled to Australia. But his brother is older and was born and survived the Holocaust in hiding in places like this. So really interesting connection with the Australian legal system. Okay, oops, I skipped one there. Okay, so I'm running out of time. That was the ghettos and houses. Obviously, you've also heard of the concentration and death camps. So the images I've got there, Dachau was a concentration camp, Auschwitz and Majdanek were death camps, but this is what it was like for the people living in there. there were bunks in the barracks, but they were incredibly crowded. So, for example, Dachau, towards the end of its time, was so overcrowded. It had 63,000 prisoners. It had rooms designed for 40 people that had 450 people crammed into them. At Auschwitz, one block contained 234 beds with 702 mattresses, but it had 1,193 prisoners in it. So they were just crowding it in. Their mattresses were made of straw or wood shavings, and so their mattresses and their bedding were just full of lice and were constantly unclean. Heating was limited if they had it at all, so sometimes they had essentially like a stove fire in the middle of the barracks, but there was only one, and they had no cooling in the heat of summer, which can get quite hot. This is the latrines at Dachau and Mauthausen, obviously looking nice and clean now, and we look at them and we tour it as a museum, but you can imagine it wasn't very nice. You can also see the lack of privacy, having to use the bathrooms in front of everybody else. These are relatively nice bathrooms, though, compared to what they had at other camps. So, yes, but definitely, even if it wasn't this nice, it was always shared latrines. Like sometimes it was just holes cut into wood that they would use them. So things like in Treblinka, they had a 2-minute limit that was placed on toilet use, and it was overseen by a so-called Scheissmaster, so the shit master, who watched them and made sure that they didn't spend more than 2 minutes on the toilet, which many people had diarrhea because the food was so bad. So you can imagine if you only had 2 minutes to use the toilet. And they were, of course, punished, whipped, if they overstayed the time limit. Time to use washrooms was minimal. They often did have the chance to clean, but it wasn't so often. There was a lot of lice, and sanitation wasn't great. So that's the Holocaust, some examples of the Holocaust. So a quick finishing up with Cambodia and then the Rohingya. In Cambodia, people were made to live a communal rural life in shared living quarters. The exception was the couples that were forcibly married by the regime. They were permitted to regularly live alone in a house. I say regularly because they were taken back to the communal housing, and then sometimes they were taken to this private house where they were forced to consummate their marriage. So an example of one survivor, she was 14 years old in 1975. She remembered sleeping in a location with other children on the ground with no roof, no walls, and no bed. In another location, they had a roof but no walls, and they slept on rice hay with stinky, stained, and threadbare rice seed bags for blankets. So the pictures that I've got here are taken at Tuol Sleng. So some of them are pictures of Tuol Sleng, but some of them are photographs of paintings that have been done by survivors about what took place in there. And you can see the image in the middle is a painting of people getting a shower, which apparently was extremely rare. So they would chain them all together. If you see up in the top, these are the leg chains that they would use. So they would be chained together in a whole row of people, which is shown in the painting up in the top here, which comes from another torture centre, Kranta Chan. And so that's why in this picture they're all grouped together, but getting a wash was very rare. This picture here was a bed. The metal container that you see was their waste facility that they used. They were also housed in these tiny little cells, essentially, for quite some time. And subject to torture, and only a handful of people survived Tuol Sleng. So just to finish up, quickly looking at what it's like in the refugee camps. So looking at the Rohingya refugee camps, you can see it's all just so crowded in together. No privacy. Inside the house, it's a dirt floor. They have a wooden bed, very little facilities to cook, and they would have one plastic chair. So I don't know if you remember back to the photos, they would have one or two plastic chairs, but they would always give me the chair because I was a guest when I came in, which, I felt awkward because they were sitting on the floor, but to them that was important that they gave me the chair. So, but that's all they have. And then down the bottom, you can see some toilets. So I did, in one of the camps, they actually had flushing toilets, which was amazing. That's the camps that have been established the longest, since before 2017. The more recent ones, the toilets are not so good. So these ones will just be drop toilets, but at least they do have a toilet there, which is a start. But here you can see where they're living, the shelters right next to this essentially kind of refuse place, with unsanitary conditions, the water full of rubbish, and there's a lot of rubbish around. They get a lot of little plastic, a lot of rubbish everywhere, and not such a nice area. So if you're lucky enough to be in one of the more established camps, the conditions are actually quite reasonable. They've got water pumps where they can get water. They've got lights with solar power on them all around, so it's a lot safer, especially for girls and women. But the ones that are more recently established, as in from 2017 onwards, at the bottom of the agglomeration, are much more lacking in facilities, lacking in safety. I could tell you there's a lot of stories, quite an experience going there. But I think my time is up, so I better stop there. But thank you so much for letting me chat to you about my book, which I really love doing the research and writing this book. So I'm hoping that when people read it, they'll also find it as interesting as I did. Thank you.
The reason I asked Mel to stop a little bit early is just to allow time for questions, and we do have time. I'm sure there will be some.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
That's great. But thinking about, in terms of roots of accountability, if you had a situation where victims, survivors have crossed the border, do you say anything in your book about, or do you have any views on state responsibility for these various human rights violations or occurring in there, not under the original state's control?
Oh, so you're talking about more like under the human rights treaties?
Yeah.
I didn't go into that, actually. I was more focused on thinking about the international criminal law side of it. But that's really interesting. And I think you can still argue that there's a responsibility there. I mean, there is extraterritorial obligations for human rights. So I think you could definitely argue that. Again, essentially using the same argument that it's foreseeable, that this is going to happen, it's inevitable. So, they should be responsible for the rights violations experienced, because essentially the rights violations are not perpetrated by the host state when they cross the border. It's only because they've had to cross the border because of the perpetrator state behaviour. So when they arrive in the host state, the host state will usually try and do what it can, obviously with the help of UNHCR, IOM, etc. But, generally I would not argue that the host state is at fault for, not providing adequate housing or food or shelter for 1 million people suddenly out of the blue. Yeah.
Hi, thank you, Cecilia. I just was really curious, right at the start of your talk, you said that in your book you discuss how you can use the human rights system to prevent genocide midstream. As so in international relations, but also I'm kind of very aware that these are in my discussions and debates. Yeah. Human rights. I'm really curious to know how you actually discuss that in your book. What do you mean by the midstream, and how you envisage the system?
Yeah, so midstream is, let's see if I can go back to the slide. It's a while back. Midstream is essentially, there it is. Essentially, I'm hoping at the end of part 2, well, preferably at the end of part 2, essentially, when we get to there. So it's kind of in the middle of the process, but particularly by the end of part 3, we certainly know. But I'd like to hope when we're looking at all of these violations that occur in part 2, we can see this is a very specific focus of human rights violations that this regime is targeting. And so then draw attention to the fact that actually we are in the genocide process, and, you know, not just kind of generally say, oh, this regime is violating, you know, freedom of expression. Not just be general about it, but draw attention to the fact that this is a genocide process, that it fits the pattern. And so from that perspective, I'm hoping it will be more like when you look back at, you know, the reports regarding Myanmar prior to 2017, they're pretty weak. So, I mean, obviously I know I'm also realistic. So Myanmar, you know, doesn't like, you know, any of its UPR report, but, you know, for example, it just ignores. I do realise that. But at least, you know, maybe hopefully getting it on the record at least, but getting it on the record as recognising, hang on, this is what's happening, but also then maybe hoping that other states will take action as well. If the G word is used there before we get to here, then, you know, we know the weight of the G word, it does carry a certain weight. So if we can use that weight when we're here, then maybe we won't get to part 4. I'm hoping.
Yeah. Okay. My question actually was considered in a way. So if I may, I found that I found the argument very compelling around human rights violations as early warning indicators. Maybe in retrospect, you look back and you realize there was legislating yesterday. But when it comes to the mainstream like that, I suppose I was less sure. Well, there are a couple of reasons. One of them is more kind of political reasons. So you mentioned the G word. So how in practice of politically would you ever be able to frame an argument that it's just not just so-called routine human rights violations?
Yes, yeah.
Genocide. That's related. So I suppose there's a two kind of questions. One, the kind of trial question. Because they not ever against genocide, and a related to my dilution question. Where when you say genocide is more than just killing, you focus on displaced population no longer at risk of extermination. I mean, a lot of the jurisprudence when stressed focus on genocide has been at pains to point out this is most exception. So when it becomes like you're living in conditions of peace and health and whatever shares in a displaced environment, I just didn't follow. Does that mean that's all of genocide? Is it continuing elements in genocide? Or what's the risk of your writer being criticized as dilution? The significance of this viral bias? Yeah, well, you know, it's comprised by a whole range of human rights violations. I didn't follow that.
Okay, so my argument is that it's these specific rights violations that happen, and so they show a specific pattern within the process. So my argument is not that when we get to the end of part 2 or the end of part 3 that there's a risk of genocide. My argument is that we're already in the genocide process and we want to stop it from progressing any further. So I think that, and that's the real difference, because often it's phrased as, oh, there's a risk when this is happening, but it's already there, because all of this is essential for the final stages to happen. You can't exterminate a population until you have brainwashed your majority population through propaganda and media control, for example. You can't get to the point where you exterminate people unless you have dehumanized them, unless you have gradually excluded them from society to ultimately make it acceptable that you exterminate these people. So that's why we argue that it's a process, not an event, and that all of this is part of it. But what I also look at is, often when, most of the time, if not all the time, when genocide is prosecuted, it's just the killing part that's prosecuted, but there are other crimes under the crime of genocide that get forgotten. So one of the things that I do in the end of every chapter is I point out how each of the behaviours that I talk about in that chapter, where they fall under the genocide crimes. So a lot of them fall under serious mental or bodily harm, but we also have imposing conditions of life, designed to bring about the end of life. And we have forcible transfer of children and so on. So there's not just, killing is not the only crime of genocide, but that keeps getting forgotten when genocide is actually prosecuted. And the importance of all the other stages of genocide is also forgotten, because the killing is obviously so significant and so serious, but we're kind of ignoring. I mean, there have been some. So, for example, obviously, after the Holocaust and World War II, there's the judges' trial, where they put judges, they prosecuted judges for how they had misused the law. And that's where you see fair trial coming up as well, the issues of fair trial, and the way they treated Jews in the legal system, which was horrendous. So there have been examples of that, but I guess my argument is not enough. There's not enough attention paid to all the other components of genocide. And so if we start doing that, then it will be their importance will be better recognised when they're in those initial stages. And so we can say that this specific targeting, we're seeing that this minority group is no longer able to access education. They're not being fairly treated within the judicial system. They can't work in the public service. They can't practice their religion. Hang on, this is a very specific targeting of this group in a very particular way. Did I cover everything that you asked? I think. Okay.
Out there. I think for the interest of time, Joe, we might
It was just a really level question for the liar.
Oh, yep, and that can take one too, but we are 1, 2, 2, so...
Why not? I go. I'm happy.
Oh, I know. I was just going to say, perhaps...
I don't fly an actual sentence, so...
think of maybe a distinction between a sociological process of genocide, which you can see underway from the beginning, part 2 here, and that process is already underway for the crime of genocide has taken place. But that sociological process, with a warning sign that the prosecutable crime is going to happen.
But my argument is that this is also prosecutable, all of this within it. That it's not just the killing at the end, it's all of the rest of it.
Well, perhaps some of that, I think some of those part 3 things are prosecutable, but not all of the things in part 2.
In the right place.
Yes. As prosecutable as genocide.
That's what I'm arguing in the book. So if you have a look, I do in each chapter demonstrate why it would fit within a particular one of the crimes of genocide. Yeah. Yeah. No, I'm happy. This is great. I'm loving the discussion because actually I haven't had the chance to have a good discussion with lawyers. So it's really great.
So I will bring us to an official close now. Thank Mel very much. But if you do want to talk to Mel later.
Yeah, as I said, don't fly out till 7. So yeah, happy to hear.